Part 2, about Cervantes and Don Quixote. 4 generations had laughed over Don Quixote before it occurred to anyone to ask, who and what manner of man was this Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, whose name is on the title page? And it was too late for a satisfactory answer to the question when it was proposed to add a life of the author to the London edition published at Lord Carteret's instance in 1738. All traces of the personality of Cervantes had by that time disappeared. Any floating traditions that may once have existed, transmitted from men who had known him, had long since died out, and of other record there was none. For the 16th and 17th centuries were incurious as to the men of the time, a reproach against which the 19th has at any rate secured itself, if it has produced no Shakespeare or Cervantes. All that Mayans y Ciscar, to whom the task was entrusted, or any of those who followed him, Rios, Pellicer, or Navarrete, could do was to eke out the few allusions Cervantes makes to himself in his various prefaces with such pieces of documentary evidence bearing upon his life as they could find. This, however, has been done by the last-named biographer to such good purpose that he has superseded all predecessors. Thoroughness is the chief characteristic of Navarrete's work. Besides sifting, testing, and methodizing with rare patience and judgment what had been previously brought to light, he left, as the saying is, no stone unturned under which anything to illustrate his subject might possibly be found. Navarrete has done all that industry and acumen could do, and it is no fault of his if he has not given us what we want. What Hallam says of Shakespeare may be applied to the almost parallel case of Cervantes. It is not the register of his baptism, or the draft of his will, or the orthography of his name that we seek. No letter of his writing, no record of his conversation, no character of him drawn by a contemporary has been produced. It is only natural, therefore, that the biographers of Cervantes, forced to make brick without straw, should have recourse largely to conjecture, and that conjecture should in some instances come by degrees to take the place of established fact. All that I propose to do here is to separate what is matter of fact from what is matter of conjecture, and leave it to the reader's judgment to decide whether the data justify the inference or not. The men whose names by common consent stand in the front rank of Spanish literature, Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Quevedo, Calderon, Garcilaso de la Vega, the Mendozas, Gongora, were all men of ancient families, and, curiously, all, except the last, of families that trace their origin to the same mountain district in the north of Spain. The family of Cervantes is commonly said to have been of Galician origin, and unquestionably it was in possession of lands in Galicia at a very early date. But I think the balance of the evidence tends to show that the Soler, the original site of the family, was at Cervatos in the northwest corner of Old Castile, close to the junction of Castile, Leon, and the Asturias. As it happens, there is a complete history of the Cervantes family from the 10th century down to the 17th extant under the title of Illustrious Ancestry, Glorious Deeds, and Noble Posterity of the famous Nuño Alfonso, Alcaide of Toledo, written in 1648 by the industrious genealogist Rodrigo Mendez Silva, who availed himself of a manuscript genealogy by Juan de Mena, the poet laureate and historiographer of John II. The origin of the name Cervantes is curious. Nuño Alfonso was almost as distinguished in the struggle against the Moors in the reign of Alfonso VII as the Cid had been half a century before in that of Alfonso VI, and was rewarded by divers grants of land in the neighborhood of Toledo. On one of his acquisitions, about 2 leagues from the city, he built himself a castle, which he called Cervatos, because he was lord of the solar of Cervatos in the Montaña, as the mountain region extending from the Basque provinces to Leon was always called. At his death in battle in 1143, the castle passed by his will to his son Alfonso Muño, who, as territorial or local surnames were then coming into vogue in place of the simple patronymic, took the additional name of Cervatos. His eldest son Pedro succeeded him in the possession of the castle, and followed his example in adopting the name, an assumption at which the younger son Gonzalo seems to have taken umbrage. Everyone who has paid even a flying visit to Toledo will remember the ruined castle that crowns the hill above the spot where the bridge of Alcantara spans the gorge of the Tagus, and with its broken outline and crumbling walls makes such an admirable pendant to the square, solid Alcazar towering over the city roofs on the opposite side. It was built, or as some say restored, by Alfonso VI shortly after his occupation of Toledo in 1085, and called by him San Servando after a Spanish martyr, a name subsequently modified into San Servan, in which form it appears in the poem of the Cid, San Cervantes and San Cervantes. With regard to which last, the Handbook for Spain warns its readers against the supposition that it has anything to do with the author of Don Quixote. Ford, as all know who have taken him for a companion and counselor on the roads of Spain, is seldom wrong in matters of literature or history. In this instance, however, he is in error. It has everything to do with the author of Don Quixote, for it is in fact these old walls that have given to Spain the name she is proudest of today. Gonzalo, above mentioned, it may be readily conceived, did not relish the appropriation by his brother of a name to which he himself had an equal right, for though nominally taken from the castle, it was in reality derived from the ancient territorial possession of the family, and as a set-off, and to distinguish himself, differentiarse, from his brother. He took as a surname the name of the castle on the bank of the Tagus, in the building of which, according to a family tradition, his great-grandfather had a share. Both brothers founded families. The Cervantes branch had more tenacity. It sent offshoots in various directions, Andalusia, Extremadura, Galicia, and Portugal, and produced a goodly line of men distinguished in the service of church and state. Gonzalo himself, and apparently a son of his, followed Ferdinand III in the great campaign of 1236 to 1248, that gave Cordova and Seville to Christian Spain and penned up the Moors in the kingdom of Granada, and his descendants intermarried with some of the noblest families of the peninsula, and numbered among them soldiers, magistrates, and church dignitaries, including at least 2 cardinal archbishops. Of the line that settled in Andalusia, Diego de Cervantes, commander of the Order of Santiago, married Juana Avellaneda, daughter of Juan Arias de Saavedra, and had several sons, of whom one was Gonzalo Gomez, corregidor of Jerez, and ancestor of the Mexican and Colombian branches of the family, and another, Juan, whose son Rodrigo married Doña Leonor de Cortinas, and by her had 4 children, Rodrigo, Andrea, Luisa, and Miguel, our author. The pedigree of Cervantes is not without its bearing on Don Quixote. A man who could look back upon an ancestry of genuine knights-errant, extending from well-nigh the time of Pelayo to the siege of Granada, was likely to have a strong feeling on the subject of the sham chivalry of the romances. It gives a point, too, to what he says in more than one place about families that have once been great and have tapered away until they have come to nothing, like a pyramid. It was the case of his own. He was born at Alcalá de Henares and baptized in the church of Santa Maria Mayor on the 9th of October, 1547. Of his boyhood and youth we know nothing, unless it be from the glimpse he gives us in the preface to his comedies of himself as a boy looking on with delight while Lope de Rueda and his company set up their rude plank stage in the plaza and acted the rustic farces which he himself afterwards took as the model of his interludes. This first glimpse, however, is a significant one, for it shows the early development of that love of the drama which exercised such an influence on his life, and seems to have grown stronger as he grew older, and of which this very preface, written only a few months before his death, is such a striking proof. He gives us to understand, too, that he was a great reader in his youth. But of this no assurance was needed, for the first part of Don Quixote alone proves a vast amount of miscellaneous reading, romances of chivalry, ballads, popular poetry, chronicles, for which he had no time or opportunity except in the first 20 years of his life. And his misquotations and mistakes in matters of detail are always, it may be noticed, those of a man recalling the reading of his boyhood. Other things besides the drama were in their infancy when Cervantes was a boy. The period of his boyhood was in every way a transition period for Spain. The old chivalrous Spain had passed away. The new Spain was the mightiest power the world had seen since the Roman Empire, and it had not yet been called upon to pay the price of its greatness. By the policy of Ferdinand and Ximenes, the sovereign had been made absolute, and the Church and Inquisition adroitly adjusted to keep him so. The nobles, who had always resisted absolutism as strenuously as they had fought the Moors, had been divested of all political power. A like fate had befallen the cities. The free constitutions of Castile and Aragon had been swept away, and the only function that remained to the Cortes was that of granting money at the king's dictation. The transition extended to literature. Men who, like Garcilaso de la Vega and Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, followed the Italian wars, had brought back from Italy the products of the post-Renaissance literature, which took root and flourished and even threatened to extinguish the native growths. Damon and Thyrsis, Phyllis and Chloe had been fairly naturalized in Spain, together with all the devices of pastoral poetry for investing with an air of novelty the idea of a despairing shepherd and inflexible shepherdess. As a set-off against this, the old historical and traditional ballads and the true pastorals, the songs and ballads of peasant life, were being collected assiduously and printed in the cancioneros that succeeded one another with increasing rapidity. But the most notable consequence, perhaps, of the spread of printing was the flood of romances of chivalry that had continued to pour from the press ever since Garci Ordóñez de Montalvo had resuscitated Amadis of Gaul at the beginning of the century. For a youth fond of reading, solid or light, there could have been no better spot in Spain than Alcalá de Henares in the middle of the 16th century. It was then a busy, populous university town, something more than the enterprising rival of Salamanca, and altogether a very different place from the melancholy, silent, deserted Alcalá the traveller sees now as he goes from Madrid to Saragossa. Theology and medicine may have been the strong points of the university, but the town itself seems to have inclined rather to the humanities and light literature, and as a producer of books, Alcalá was already beginning to compete with the older presses of Toledo, Burgos, Salamanca, and Seville. A pendant to the picture Cervantes has given us of his first playgoings might, no doubt, have been often seen in the streets of Alcalá at that time, a bright, eager, tawny-haired boy peering into a bookshop where the latest volumes lay open to tempt the public, wondering, it may be, what that little book with the woodcut of the blind beggar and his boy, that called itself Vida de Lazarillo de Tormes, Segunda Impresión, could be about, or with eyes brimming over with merriment gazing at one of those preposterous portraits of a knight-errant in outrageous panoply and plumes, with which the publishers of chivalry romances loved to embellish the title pages of their folios. If the boy was the father of the man, the sense of the incongruous that was strong at 50 was lively at 10, and some such reflections as these may have been the true genesis of Don Quixote. For his more solid education, we are told, he went to Salamanca. But why Rodrigo de Cervantes, who was very poor, should have sent his son to a university 150 miles away when he had one at his own door, would be a puzzle, if we had any reason for supposing that he did so. The only evidence is a vague statement by Professor Tomas Gonzalez that he once saw an old entry of the matriculation of a Miguel de Cervantes. This does not appear to have been ever seen again. But even if it had, and if the date corresponded, it would prove nothing, as there were at least 2 other Miguels born about the middle of the century. One of them, moreover, a Cervantes Saavedra, a cousin, no doubt, who was a source of great embarrassment to the biographers. That he was a student neither at Salamanca nor at Alcalá is best proved by his own works. No man drew more largely upon experience than he did, and he has nowhere left a single reminiscence of student life. For the Tia Fingida, if it be his, is not one. Nothing, not even a college joke, to show that he remembered days that most men remember best. All that we know positively about his education is that Juan López de Hoyos, a professor of humanities and belles-lettres of some eminence, calls him his dear and beloved pupil. This was in a little collection of verses by different hands on the death of Isabel de Valois, second queen of Philip II, published by the professor in 1569, to which Cervantes contributed 4 pieces, including an elegy, and an epitaph in the form of a sonnet. It is only by a rare chance that a Lycidas finds its way into a volume of this sort, and Cervantes was no Milton. His verses are no worse than such things usually are, so much at least may be said for them. By the time the book appeared he had left Spain, and, as fate ordered it, for 12 years, the most eventful ones of his life. Giulio, afterwards cardinal, Aquaviva, had been sent at the end of 1568 to Philip II by the Pope on a mission partly of condolence, partly political, and on his return to Rome, which was somewhat brusquely expedited by the king, he took Cervantes with him as his camarero, chamberlain, the office he himself held in the Pope's household. The post would no doubt have led to advancement at the papal court had Cervantes retained it, but in the summer of 1570 he resigned it, and enlisted as a private soldier in Captain Diego Urbina's company, belonging to Don Miguel de Moncada's regiment, but at that time forming a part of the command of Mark Antony Colonna. What impelled him to this step we know not, whether it was distaste for the career before him, or purely military enthusiasm. It may well have been the latter, for it was a stirring time. The events, however, which led to the alliance between Spain, Venice, and the Pope, against the common enemy, the Porte, and to the victory of the combined fleets at Lepanto, belong rather to the history of Europe than to the life of Cervantes. He was one of those that sailed from Messina in September 1571, under the command of Don John of Austria. But on the morning of the 7th of October, when the Turkish fleet was sighted, He was lying below, ill with fever. At the news that the enemy was in sight, he rose, and in spite of the remonstrances of his comrades and superiors, insisted on taking his post, saying he preferred death in the service of God and the king to health. His galley, the Marquesa, was in the thick of the fight, and before it was over he had received 3 gunshot wounds, 2 in the breast and 1 in the left hand or arm. On the morning after the battle, according to Navarrete, he had an interview with the commander-in-chief, Don John, who was making a personal inspection of the wounded, one result of which was an addition of 3 crowns to his pay, and another, apparently, the friendship of his general. How severely Cervantes was wounded may be inferred from the fact that, with youth, a vigorous frame, and as cheerful and buoyant a temperament as ever invalid had, he was 7 months in hospital at Messina before he was discharged. He came out with his left hand permanently disabled. He had lost the use of it, as Mercury told him in the Viaje del Parnaso, for the greater glory of the right. This, however, did not absolutely unfit him for service, and in April 1572 he joined Manuel Ponce de Leon's company of Lope de Figueroa's regiment, in which it seems probable his brother Rodrigo was serving, and shared in the operations of the next 3 years, including the capture of the Goleta and Tunis. Taking advantage of the lull which followed the recapture of these places by the Turks, he obtained leave to return to Spain, and sailed from Naples in September 1575 on board the Sun galley, in company with his brother Rodrigo, Pedro Carrillo de Quesada, late governor of the Goleta, and some others, and furnished with letters from Don John of Austria and the Duke of Sessa, the Viceroy of Sicily, recommending him to the king for the command of a company, on account of his services, a dono infelice as events proved. On the 26th they fell in with a squadron of Algerine galleys, and after a stout resistance were overpowered and carried into Algiers. By means of a ransomed fellow captive, the brothers contrived to inform their family of their condition, and the poor people at Alcalá at once strove to raise the ransom money, the father disposing of all he possessed, and the 2 sisters giving up their marriage portions. But Dalimami had found on Cervantes the letters addressed to the king by Don John and the Duke of Sessa, and, concluding that his prize must be a person of great consequence, when the money came, he refused it scornfully as being altogether insufficient. The owner of Rodrigo, however, was more easily satisfied. Ransom was accepted in his case, and it was arranged between the brothers that he should return to Spain and procure a vessel in which he was to come back to Algiers, and take off Miguel and as many of their comrades as possible. This was not the first attempt to escape that Cervantes had made. Soon after the commencement of his captivity, he induced several of his companions to join him in trying to reach Oran, then a Spanish post, on foot. But after the first day's journey, the Moor who had agreed to act as their guide deserted them, and they had no choice but to return. The second attempt was more disastrous. In a garden outside the city on the seashore, he constructed, with the help of the gardener, a Spaniard, a hiding place, to which he brought, one by one, 14 of his fellow captives, keeping them there in secrecy for several months, and supplying them with food through a renegade known as El Dorador, the Gilder. How he, a captive himself, contrived to do all this is one of the mysteries of the story. Wild as the project may appear, it was very nearly successful. The vessel procured by Rodrigo made its appearance off the coast, and under cover of night was proceeding to take off the refugees, when the crew were alarmed by a passing fishing boat, and beat a hasty retreat. On renewing the attempt shortly afterwards, they, or a portion of them at least, were taken prisoners, and just as the poor fellows in the garden were exulting in the thought that in a few moments more freedom would be within their grasp, they found themselves surrounded by Turkish troops, horse and foot. The Dorador had revealed the whole scheme to the Dey Hassan. When Cervantes saw what had befallen them, he charged his companions to lay all the blame upon him, and as they were being bound, he declared aloud that the whole plot was of his contriving, and that nobody else had any share in it. Brought before the Dey, he said the same. He was threatened with impalement and with torture. And as cutting off ears and noses were playful freaks with the Algerines, it may be conceived what their tortures were like. But nothing could make him swerve from his original statement that he, and he alone, was responsible. The upshot was that the unhappy gardener was hanged by his master, and the prisoners taken possession of by the Dey, who, however, afterwards restored most of them to their masters, but kept Cervantes, paying Dalimami 500 crowns for him. He felt, no doubt, that a man of such resource, energy, and daring was too dangerous a piece of property to be left in private hands, and he had him heavily ironed and lodged in his own prison. If he thought that by these means he could break the spirit or shake the resolution of his prisoner, he was soon undeceived, for Cervantes contrived before long to dispatch a letter to the governor of Oran, entreating him to send him someone that could be trusted, to enable him and 3 other gentlemen, fellow captives of his, to make their escape, intending evidently to renew his first attempt with a more trustworthy guide. Unfortunately, the Moor who carried the letter was stopped just outside Oran, and the letter being found upon him, he was sent back to Algiers, where by the order of the Dey he was promptly impaled as a warning to others, while Cervantes was condemned to receive 2,000 blows of the stick, a number which most likely would have deprived the world of Don Quixote, had not some persons, who they were we know not, interceded on his behalf. After this, he seems to have been kept in still closer confinement than before, for nearly 2 years past before he made another attempt. This time his plan was to purchase, by the aid of a Spanish renegade and 2 Valencian merchants resident in Algiers, an armed vessel in which he and about 60 of the leading captives were to make their escape. But just as they were about to put it into execution, one Dr. Juan Blanco de Paz, an ecclesiastic and a compatriot, informed the Dey of the plot. Cervantes, by force of character, by his self-devotion, by his untiring energy, and his exertions to lighten the lot of his companions in misery, had endeared himself to all, and become the leading spirit in the captive colony, and, incredible as it may seem, jealousy of his influence and the esteem in which he was held, moved this man to compass his destruction by a cruel death. The merchants, finding that the Dey knew all, and fearing that Cervantes under torture might make disclosures that would imperil their own lives, tried to persuade him to slip away on board a vessel that was on the point of sailing for Spain. But he told them they had nothing to fear, for no tortures would make him compromise anybody, and he went at once and gave himself up to the Dey. As before, the Dey tried to force him to name his accomplices. Everything was made ready for his immediate execution. The halter was put round his neck, and his hands tied behind him, but all that could be got from him was that he himself, with the help of 4 gentlemen who had since left Algiers, had arranged the whole, and that the 60 who were to accompany him were not to know anything of it until the last moment. Finding he could make nothing of him, the Dey sent him back to prison more heavily ironed than before. The poverty-stricken Cervantes family had been all this time trying once more to raise the ransom money, and at last a sum of 300 ducats was got together and entrusted to the Redemptorist Father Juan Gil, who was about to sail for Algiers. The Dey, however, demanded more than double the sum offered, and as his term of office had expired and he was about to sail for Constantinople, taking all his slaves with him, the case of Cervantes was critical. He was already on board, heavily ironed, when the Dey at length agreed to reduce his demand by 1/2, and Father Gill, by borrowing, was able to make up the amount. And on September 19th, 1580, after a captivity of 5 years all but a week, Cervantes was at last set free. Before long he discovered that Blanco de Paz, who claimed to be an officer of the Inquisition, was now concocting on false evidence a charge of misconduct to be brought against him on his return to Spain. To checkmate him, Cervantes drew up a series of 25 questions, covering the whole period of his captivity, upon which he requested Father Gill to take the depositions of credible witnesses before a notary. 11 witnesses taken from among the principal captives in Algiers deposed to all the facts above stated, and to a great deal more besides. There is something touching in the admiration, love, and gratitude we see struggling to find expression in the formal language of the notary, as they testify one after another to the good deeds of Cervantes, how he comforted and helped the weak-hearted, how he kept up their drooping courage, how he shared his poor purse with this deponent, and how in him this deponent found father and mother. On his return to Spain, he found his old regiment about to march for Portugal to support Philip's claim to the crown, and, utterly penniless now, had no choice but to rejoin it. He was in the expeditions to the Azores in 1582, and the following year, and on the conclusion of the war, returned to Spain in the autumn of 1583, bringing with him the manuscript of his pastoral romance, the Galatea, and probably also, to judge by internal evidence, that of the first portion of Persiles and Sigismunda. He also brought back with him, his biographers assert, an infant daughter, the offspring of an amour, as some of them with great circumstantiality inform us, with a Lisbon lady of noble birth, whose name, however, as well as that of the street she lived in, they omit to mention. The sole foundation for all this is that in 1605 there certainly was living in the family of Cervantes a Doña Isabel de Saavedra, who is described in an official document as his natural daughter, and then 20 years of age. With his crippled left hand, promotion in the army was hopeless, now that Don John was dead and he had no one to press his claims and services, and for a man drawing on to 40, life in the ranks was a dismal prospect. He had already a certain reputation as a poet. He made up his mind, therefore, to cast his lot with literature, and for a first venture committed his Galatea to the press. It was published, as Salva y Malin shows conclusively, at Alcalá, his own birthplace, in 1585, and no doubt helped to make his name more widely known, but certainly did not do him much good in any other way. While it was going through the press, he married Doña Catalina de Palacios Salazar y Vosmediano, a lady of the Esquivias near Madrid, and apparently a friend of the family, who brought him a fortune which may possibly have served to keep the wolf from the door, but if so, that was all. The drama had by this time outgrown marketplace stages and strolling companies, and with his old love for it he naturally turned to it for a congenial employment. In about 3 years he wrote 20 or 30 plays, which he tells us were performed without any throwing of cucumbers or other missiles, and ran their course without any hisses, outcries, or disturbance. In other words, his plays were not bad enough to be hissed off the stage, but not good enough to hold their own upon it. Only 2 of them have been preserved, but as they happen to be 2 of the 7 or 8 he mentions with complacency, we may assume they are favorable specimens, and no one who reads the Numancia and the Trato de Argel will feel any surprise that they failed as acting dramas. Whatever merits they may have, whatever occasional they may show, they are, as regards construction, incurably clumsy. How completely they failed is manifest from the fact that with all his sanguine temperament and indomitable perseverance, he was unable to maintain the struggle to gain a livelihood as a dramatist for more than 3 years. Nor was the rising popularity of Lope the cause, as is often said, notwithstanding his own words to the contrary. When Lope began to write for the stage is uncertain, but it was certainly after Cervantes went to Sevilla. Among the nuevos documentos printed by Señor Arsencio y Toledo is one dated 1592 and curiously characteristic of Cervantes. It is an agreement with one Rodrigo Osorio, a manager, who was to accept 6 comedies at 50 ducats, about £6 apiece, not to be paid in any case unless it appeared on representation that the said comedy was one of the best that had ever been represented in Spain. The test does not seem to have been ever applied. Perhaps it was sufficiently apparent to Rodrigo Osorio that the comedies were not among the best that had ever been represented. Among the correspondence of Cervantes there might have been found, no doubt, more than one letter like that we see in the Rake's Progress. "Sir, I have read your play, and it will not do." He was more successful in a literary contest at Saragossa in 1595, in honor of the canonization of Saint Jacinto, when his composition won the first prize, 3 silver spoons. The year before this he had been appointed a collector of revenues for the kingdom of Granada. In order to remit the money he had collected more conveniently to the treasury, he entrusted it to a merchant, who failed and absconded. And as the bankrupt's assets were insufficient to cover the whole, he was sent to prison at Sevilla in September 1597. The balance against him, however, was a small one, about £26, and on giving security for it he was released at the end of the year. It was as he journeyed from town to town collecting the king's taxes that he noted down those bits of inn and wayside life and character that abound in the pages of Don Quixote. The Benedictine monks with spectacles and sunshades, mounted on their tall mules, the strollers in costume bound for the next village, the barber with his basin on his head, on his way to bleed a patient, the recruit with his breeches in his bundle, tramping along the road singing, the reapers gathered in the Venta gateway, listening to Felix Marte of Hircania read out to them, and those little Hogarthian touches that he so well knew how to bring in, the ox-tail hanging up with the landlord's comb stuck in it, the wineskins at the bedhead, and those notable examples of hostelry art, Helen going off in high spirits on Paris's arm, and Dido on the tower dropping tears as big as walnuts. Nay, it may well be that on those journeys into remote regions he came across now and then a specimen of the pauper gentleman, with his lean hack and his greyhound and his books of chivalry, dreaming away his life in happy ignorance that the world had changed since his great-grandfather's old helmet was new. But it was in Sevilla that he found out his true vocation, though he himself would not by any means have admitted it to be so. It was there, in Triana, that he was first tempted to try his hand at drawing from life, and first brought his humour into play in the exquisite little sketch of Rinconete y Cortadillo, the germ in more ways than one of Don Quixote. Where and when that was written we cannot tell. After his imprisonment, all trace of Cervantes in his official capacity disappears, from which it may be inferred that he was not reinstated. That he was still in Sevilla in November 1598 appears from a satirical sonnet of his on the elaborate catafalque erected to testify the grief of the city at the death of Philip II, but from this up to 1603 we have no clue to his movements. The words in the preface to the first part of Don Quixote are generally held to be conclusive that he conceived the idea of the book, and wrote the beginning of it at least, in a prison, and that he may have done so is extremely likely. There is a tradition that Cervantes read some portions of his work to a select audience at the Duke of Bejar's, which may have helped to make the book known. But the obvious conclusion is that the first part of Don Quixote lay on his hands some time before he could find a publisher bold enough to undertake a venture of so novel a character, and so little faith in it had Francisco Robles of Madrid, to whom at last he sold it, that he did not care to incur the expense of securing the copyright for Aragon or Portugal, contenting himself with that for Castile. The printing was finished in December, and the book came out with the new year, 1605. It is often said that Don Quixote was at first received coldly. The facts show just the contrary. No sooner was it in the hands of the public than preparations were made to issue pirated editions at Lisbon and Valencia, and to bring out a second edition with the additional copyrights for Aragon and Portugal, which he secured in February. No doubt it was received with something more than coldness by certain sections of the community. Men of wit, taste, and discrimination among the aristocracy gave it a hearty welcome, but the aristocracy in general were not likely to relish a book that turned their favorite reading into ridicule and laughed at so many of their favorite ideas. The dramatists who gathered round Lope as their leader regarded Cervantes as their common enemy, and it is plain that he was equally obnoxious to the other clique, the culto poets who had Gongora for their chief. Navarrete, who knew nothing of the letter above mentioned, tries hard to show that the relations between Cervantes and Lope were of a very friendly sort, as indeed they were until Don Quixote was written. Cervantes, indeed, to the last generously and manfully declared his admiration of Lope's powers, his unfailing invention, and his marvelous fertility. But in the preface of the first part of Don Quixote, and in the verses of Urganda the Unknown, and one or two other places, there are, if we read between the lines, sly hits at Lope's vanities and affectations that argue no personal goodwill. And Lope openly sneers at Don Quixote and Cervantes, and 14 years after his death gives him only a few lines of cold commonplace in the Laurel de Apolo, that seem all the colder for the eulogies of a host of non-entities whose names are found nowhere else. In 1601, Valladolid was made the seat of the court, and at the beginning of 1603 Cervantes had been summoned thither in connection with the balance due by him to the treasury, which was still outstanding. He remained at Valladolid, apparently supporting himself by agencies and scrivener's work of some sort, probably drafting petitions and drawing up statements of claims to be presented to the council and the like. So, at least, we gather from the depositions taken on the occasion of the death of a gentleman, the victim of a street brawl, who had been carried into the house in which he lived. In these he himself is described as a man who wrote and transacted business, and it appears that his household then consisted of his wife, the natural daughter Isabel de Saavedra already mentioned, his sister Andrea, now a widow, her daughter Constanza, a mysterious Magdalena de Sotomayor, calling herself his sister, for whom his biographers cannot account, and a servant maid. Meanwhile, Don Quixote had been growing in favor, and its author's name was now known beyond the Pyrenees. In 1607, an edition was printed at Brussels. Robles, the Madrid publisher, found it necessary to meet the demand by a third edition, the seventh in all, in 1608. The popularity of the book in Italy was such that a Milan bookseller was led to bring out an edition in 1610, and another was called for in Brussels in 1611. It might naturally have been expected that, with such proofs before him that he had hit the taste of the public, Cervantes would have at once set about redeeming his rather vague promise of a second volume. But, to all appearance, nothing was farther from his thoughts. He had still by him one or two short tales of the same vintage as those he had inserted in Don Quixote, and instead of continuing the adventures of Don Quixote, he set to work to write more of these novelas exemplares, as he afterwards called them, with a view to making a book of them. The novels were published in the summer of 1613, with a dedication to the Conde de Lemos, the Maecenas of the day, and with one of those chatty, confidential prefaces Cervantes was so fond of. In this, 8 years and a half after the first part of Don Quixote had appeared, we get the first hint of a forthcoming second part. "You shall see shortly," he says, "the further exploits of Don Quixote and humours of Sancho Panza." His idea of "shortly" was a somewhat elastic one, for as we know by the date to Sancho's letter, he had barely one half of the book completed that time 12 months. But more than poems, or pastorals, or novels, it was his dramatic ambition that engrossed his thoughts. The same indomitable spirit that kept him from despair in the bagnios of Algiers, and prompted him to attempt the escape of himself and his comrades again and again, made him persevere in spite of failure and discouragement in his efforts to win the ear of the public as a dramatist. The temperament of Cervantes was essentially sanguine. The portrait he draws in the preface to the novels, with the aquiline features, chestnut hair, smooth, untroubled forehead, and bright, cheerful eyes, is the very portrait of a sanguine man. Nothing that the managers might say could persuade him that the merits of his plays would not be recognized at last if they were only given a fair chance. The old soldier of the Spanish Salamis was bent on being the Aeschylus of Spain. He was to found a great national drama, based on the true principles of art, that was to be the envy of all nations. He was to drive from the stage the silly, childish plays, the mirrors of nonsense and models of folly, that were in vogue through the cupidity of the managers and short-sightedness of the authors. He was to correct and educate the public taste until it was ripe for tragedies on the model of the Greek drama, like the Numancia, for instance, and comedies that would not only amuse but improve and instruct. All this he was to do, could he once get a hearing. There was the initial difficulty. He shows plainly enough, too, that Don Quixote and the demolition of the chivalry romances was not the work that lay next his heart. He was indeed, as he says himself in his preface, more a stepfather than a father to Don Quixote. Never was great work so neglected by its author. That it was written carelessly, hastily, and by fits and starts, was not always his fault. But it seems clear he never read what he sent to the press. He knew how the printers had blundered, but he never took the trouble to correct them when the third edition was in progress, as a man who really cared for the child of his brain would have done. He appears to have regarded the book as little more than a mere libro de entretenimiento, an amusing book, a thing, as he says in the Vieja, to divert the melancholy, moody heart at any time or season. No doubt he had an affection for his hero, and was very proud of Sancho Panza. It would have been strange indeed if he had not been proud of the most humorous creation in all fiction. He was proud, too, of the popularity and success of the book, and beyond measure delightful is the naivete with which he shows his pride in a dozen passages in the second part. But it was not the success he coveted. In all probability he would have given all the success of Don Quixote, nay, would have seen every copy of Don Quixote burned in the Plaza Mayor, for one such success as Lope de Vega was enjoying on an average once a week. And so he went on, dawdling over Don Quixote, adding a chapter now and again, and putting it aside to turn to Persiles and Sigismunda, which, as we know, was to be the most entertaining book in the language, and the rival of Theagenes and Chariclea, or finishing off one of his darling comedies. And if Robles asked when Don Quixote would be ready, the answer no doubt was, en breve, shortly. There was time enough for that. At 68 he was as full of life and hope and plans for the future as a boy of 18. nemesis was coming, however. He had got as far as chapter 59, which at his leisurely pace he could hardly have reached before October or November 1614, when there was put into his hand a small octave lately printed at Tarragona, and calling itself Second Volume of the Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, by the licentiate Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda of Tordesillas. The last half of chapter 59 and most of the following chapters of the second part give us some idea of the effect produced upon him, and his irritation was not likely to be lessened by the reflection that he had no one to blame but himself. Had Avellaneda, in fact, been content with merely bringing out a continuation to Don Quixote, Cervantes would have had no reasonable grievance. His own intentions were expressed in the very vaguest language at the end of the book, nay, in his last words, forse altro cantera conmiglior pletro. He seems actually to invite someone else to continue the work, and he made no sign until 8 years and a half had gone by which time Avellaneda's volume was no doubt written. In fact, Cervantes had no case, or a very bad one, as far as the mere continuation was concerned. But Avellaneda chose to write a preface to it, full of such coarse personal abuse as only an ill-conditioned man could pour out. He taunts Cervantes with being old, with having lost his hand, with having been in prison, with being poor, with being friendless, accuses him of envy of Lope's success, of petulance and querulousness, and so on. And it was in this that the sting lay. Avellaneda's reason for this personal attack is obvious enough. Whoever he may have been, it is clear that he was one of the dramatists of Lope's school, for he has the impudence to charge Cervantes with attacking him as well as Lope in his criticism of the drama. His identification has exercised the best critics and baffled all the ingenuity and research that has been brought to bear on it. Navarrete and Ticknor both inclined to the belief that Cervantes knew who he was. But I must say I think the anger he shows suggests an invisible assailant. It is like the irritation of a man stung by a mosquito in the dark. Cervantes from certain solecisms of language pronounces him to be an Aragonese, and Pellicer, an Aragonese himself, supports this view and believes him, moreover, to have been an ecclesiastic, a Dominican probably. Any merit Avellaneda has is reflected from Cervantes, and he is too dull to reflect much. Dull and dirty will always be, I imagine, the verdict of the vast majority of unprejudiced readers. He is, at best, a poor plagiarist. All he can do is to follow slavishly the lead given him by Cervantes. His only humor lies in making Don Quixote take inns for castles and fancy himself some legendary or historical personage, and Sancho mistake words, invert proverbs, and display his gluttony. All through, he shows a proclivity to coarseness and dirt, and he has contrived to introduce 2 tales filthier than anything by the 16th century novelieri, and without their sprightliness. But whatever Avellaneda and his book may be, we must not forget the debt we owe them. But for them, there can be no doubt, Don Quixote would have come to us a mere torso instead of a complete work. Even if Cervantes had finished the volume he had in hand, most assuredly he would have left off with a promise of a 3rd part, giving the further adventures of Don Quixote and humours of Sancho Panza as shepherds. It is plain that he had at one time an intention of dealing with the pastoral romances, as he had dealt with the books of chivalry. And but for Avellaneda, he would have tried to carry it out. But it is more likely that, with his plans and projects and hopefulness, the volume would have remained unfinished till his death, and that we should have never made the acquaintance of the Duke and Duchess, or gone with Sancho to Barataria.